I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to be here. It's a wonderful experience to be in Korea. It's one of my favorite places to go. I love talking to Koreans about security issues. And it's especially important to be here for the 70th anniversary of Korea's liberation. The subject that I'm going to talk about today is the rise of China and its implications for South Korea. And what I'd like to do in my talk is I'd like to deal with two specific questions. First of all, what are the implications of China's rise for East Asia? Let's leave South Korea off the table for the moment. Just what are the general implications of China's rise? And then secondly, I'd like to focus on four specific questions that have to do with South Korea in particular. So in a sense, the talk is divided into two parts, the more general half and the half that is focused on South Korea. There's a key assumption underpinning my talk, which is that I am simply assuming that China will continue to grow at an impressive rate over the next 30 or 40 years, similar to the way it has grown economically over the past 30 years. I'm not saying that will happen, and I'll talk more about that at the end, but I'm assuming that China is going to continue to rise. And that's not a given, again. Another point I want to make is that when we talk about what's likely to happen in the future, there's no way you can do that without a theory. And the reason is that we have no facts about the future because the future hasn't happened yet. You can look at the present, you can look at facts that involve the present, and you can extrapolate from that forward. But that doesn't take you very far. What you have to do is come up with a theory of great power politics. You have to have a theory, in my opinion, that explains how China is likely to behave that is consistent with past great power behavior, present great power behavior. And if the theory is logically compelling and it looks like it squares with the historical record, that should give us confidence that it will do a good job of predicting what the future would look like. But it's just very important to understand that this is a theoretical enterprise, and people who argue against me just offer alternative theories. Basic outline of the talk is that I'm going to lay out my theory of great power politics and explain to you how I think great powers behave. Then number two, I'm going to give you a synoptic version of American foreign policy from 1783 to the present. And I'm basically going to try and show you that the United States has behaved in accordance with my theory over time. Hopefully that will give you some confidence in the theory. And then I'm going to talk about China and what China is likely to do as it gets more powerful. And my basic argument will be that China is going to imitate the United States, and China is going to act, therefore, according to my basic theory. And then I'll talk about what the United States and most of China's neighbors are likely to do. Finally, I'll switch gears and I'll talk about four specific questions that I think are of central importance that have to do with South Korea and China's rise. So let me begin with my theory. I already told you that. My theory. I start with 5 simple assumptions about how the world is organized. Then you take those 5 simple assumptions, you put them in a blender, you hit the on switch, you mix them up, and you get 3 kinds of behavior. And then when you look carefully at those 3 kinds of behavior that characterize the activities of great powers in the system, what you see is that the most powerful states in the system have 2 concrete goals. And of course, I'll lay all this out for you. But let me start with my assumptions. And these are basically assumptions about the structure of the system. First point you want to keep in mind is that states are the key actors in the system, and the system is anarchic. Anarchic doesn't mean murder and mayhem here. Anarchic means that the system is organized in a way that there's no higher authority that sits above states. The opposite of anarchy is hierarchy. In other words, there's no international institution that has any meaningful power that sits above states. States are the key actors in the system, and they have no higher authority that sits above them. This is what anarchy is. States are like pool balls on a table. Second, all states have some offensive military capability, and a handful of them have a lot of relative military capability. Obviously, there are states like the United States, China, Russia, Israel, that have a lot of offensive punch. And there are other states that don't have much at all, but they have some. So all states have some offensive military capability. Third assumption is very important. It has to do with intentions. Remember, the second assumption had to do with capabilities. The third assumption has to do with intentions. And this is the argument that you can never know the intentions of other states. You certainly can't know their intentions in the future. None of you know who's going to be governing China or the United States in 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years. So how can you know what the intentions of those leaders are going to be? You just can't know them. It's, in my opinion, almost impossible to know for sure what the intentions of leaders are today. And the main reason is that intentions are inside the heads of human beings, and we can't see inside people's heads. Capabilities, to go back to the assumption, the second assumption, capabilities are discernible with the human eye. During the Cold War, for example, when I was young, we used to look at the Soviet threat, and we cared about Soviet capabilities, and we cared about Soviet intentions. We had very little difficulty figuring out what Soviet capabilities were, because we could see them. Soviet intentions, we had huge debates about what Soviet intentions were, and we never reached any consensus on what they are, or what they were, in large part because they were in the heads of Soviet leaders. So the first assumption is there's no higher authority that sits above states. That's anarchy. Second assumption is all states have some offensive military capability, and some of them have a lot. And the third assumption is you can never be sure what the intentions of other states are, especially regarding future intentions. Fourth assumption, very simple one, the principal goal, or the highest goal of states, is to survive. This is not to say that states don't have other goals, but survival has to be the number one goal, because if you don't survive, you can't pursue the other goals. Period. End of story. Fifth assumption is that states are rational actors. They're strategic calculators. This is just a way of saying states are really pretty good at figuring out what the best strategies are for survival. That's the rational actor assumption. So those are 5 assumptions. As I said to you before, you take those 5 assumptions, you put them in the blender, you hit the on switch, you mix the 5 of them up, and this is what you get. First of all, states fear each other. I don't deny that the level of fear varies from case to case, but states fear each other. They fear each other for 2 reasons. The first reason they fear each other is because you may end up next to another state that has significant offensive military capability and malign intentions, bad intentions. That's the first reason. The second reason that you fear other states is because there's no higher authority that you can call on when you get in trouble. There's no night watchman. There's no ultimate arbiter in the international system. It's an anarchic system. As you know, in the United States, if you want to call the police, you dial 911. As I always say to students, if you dial 911 in the international system, you know who's at the other end? Nobody. This leads to the second form of behavior. States understand it's a self-help world. As my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. States figure that out very quickly. Again, there's no higher authority to help you. You helped yourself. This is not to say you can't form alliances and depend on other countries, but it is basically a self-help world. Third, and very importantly, states figure out that the best way to survive is to maximize the amount of world power that they control. You want to be really powerful in the international system. How many Americans do you think go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico or Guatemala attacking us? None. No American worries about anyone in the Western Hemisphere attacking us. Why? Because we are Godzilla. We are incredibly powerful. And when you're incredibly powerful, nobody picks on you. Right? So the name of the game is to be really powerful. And again, you want to remember here, you want to be really powerful because it's the best way to survive. It's not because you are essentially maligned, that there's something wrong with your DNA. No. When you're in an anarchic system where states have potential military capability of great significance, a lot of offensive military capability is possible, and where they may have malign intentions, the best way to survive is to be very powerful. What does that mean in practice? In practice, it means two things. One, you want to be a regional hegemon. You want to dominate your area of the world. You want to do what the United States does in the Western Hemisphere. And I'm getting ahead of myself here. If I'm China, I want to dominate Asia. You do not want to be weak. You want to be really powerful. You want to be like the United States. Right? You want to be a regional hegemon. And number two, you want to make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world. In other words, to put it in Pentagonese, you want to make sure you don't have a peer competitor. Now, why is that the case? Because if some state dominates its region of the world, it's then free to wander all over the planet and into your backyard. Most of you have never thought about this, but why do you think it is that the United States wanders all over the globe, sticking its nose in everybody's business? It's because it is a regional hegemon. It is free to roam. It has no security threats in its own environment. So it's free to wander into East Asia, and from a Chinese point of view, cause all sorts of trouble. What the United States doesn't want is for China to dominate Asia and be free to roam into the Western Hemisphere. We'd rather see a situation where there's a balance of power in East Asia, and the Chinese have to worry about the Japanese, the Russians, the Indians, and so forth and so on, so they have less time to think about coming into the Western Hemisphere. So starting with those 5 assumptions, I end up with a story that says, number one, you want to be a regional hegemon, and number two, you do not want a peer competitor. That's the basic theory. Let's talk about the Americans. As you know, we declared our independence in 1776, but we didn't get independence until 1783. So from 1783 up to the present, I think if you look at how the United States behaves, it fits very neatly with my theory. First of all, we started out as 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. We marched across North America. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans. We stole their land. We went to war with Mexico in the middle of the 19th century. We stole from Mexico what is now the southwest of the United States. We invaded Canada in 1812 with the express purpose of making Canada part of the United States. The reason that Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is that the British, who were then in control of Canada, expected us to pay a return visit. The Caribbean would be American territory today were it not for the slavery issue. The southern states were deeply committed to making the Caribbean part of the United States of America. The northern states wouldn't let it happen because they understood they would be slave-holding states. The United States had a voracious appetite for conquest. There's no country in modern history that equals us when it comes to expansion, when it comes to conquest and acquiring territory. That's how the United States of today was created. Furthermore, we had a second goal, which was to throw the European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere and tell them that they were never welcome back. It's called the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. Old President James Monroe told the European great powers, we're not strong enough to throw you out now. We're eventually going to throw you out. And when we throw you out, you're not welcome back. This is our hemisphere. We run it. And we do not want any distant great powers coming into the Western Hemisphere. I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. It enraged the United States of America that Fidel Castro had the audacity to invite the Soviets to bring military capability into the Western Hemisphere. This is categorically unacceptable to Uncle Sam. And this is one of the principal reasons that it's only now, in 2015, that we're improving relations with Fidel Castro. So my point to you is that the United States went to great lengths to achieve regional hegemony on purpose, for good security reasons, and did so at the end of the 19th century. Second part of the story, as I told you, has to do with peer competitors. The United States played a key role in putting the 4 potential peer competitors on the scrap heap of history in the 20th century. Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union all threatened to dominate either Europe or Asia. The United States, in accordance with my theory, does not tolerate peer competitors. And we go to great lengths to contain them, and if we can destroy them, we destroy them. All this is to say, I think that basically the United States has behaved as my theory predicts. This brings us to the question of how China will act. My argument, as I told you, is that it will imitate the United States. It will try to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. First of all, it's going to attempt to become the most powerful state in Asia. The Chinese would be fools not to try to be the most powerful state in Asia. The Chinese remember very well what happened when they were weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. The Japanese, the Americans, and the Europeans took advantage of them. Those distant great powers, and in the Japanese case, local great power, did terrible things to China. Why? Because China was weak. China's not going to let this happen again. It's going to want to be by far the most powerful state in Asia. It's going to want to dominate Asia, and I don't blame the Chinese one bit. Is it going to have a Monroe Doctrine of its own? It certainly is. Do you think the Chinese, as they get more and more powerful, aren't going to try and push the United States out of East Asia the way we pushed the European great powers out of the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century? They're going to try, for sure. They'd be crazy not to. As my mother taught me again when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we can have a Monroe Doctrine, I want you to tell me why the Chinese shouldn't have a Monroe Doctrine. I might not like that as an American. You might not like that if you're Japanese or Korean. But we're talking about what the Chinese think is in their national interest. And in their national interest, it makes sense to be Godzilla here in East Asia, if not all of Asia. Furthermore, I think that China is likely to meddle in the Western Hemisphere, the way the United States meddles in Asia. What the Chinese want to do is cause problems for the United States in America's backyard, because then America will have to concentrate on the Western Hemisphere and won't be so free to roam into places like East Asia, which is in their interest. So my argument to you, again, is that China is going to go to great lengths to imitate the United States, which is, in my opinion, consistent with my theory. How are the United States and China's neighbors likely to react? The United States is likely to go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia, as my theory predicts and as the historical record makes clear. We do not tolerate peer competitors. And this is what the pivot to Asia is all about. How are China's neighbors likely to react? I think almost all of China's neighbors are likely to ally with the United States to form a balancing coalition against China. You can already see evidence of this. The Filipinos are talking, about inviting us back to Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base. If you go home and Google Japanese-Indian strategic relations, you'll see that relations between those two countries is improving significantly. U.S. relations with Vietnam are improving significantly. The balancing coalition is beginning to form. It will include countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, India, and even Russia, ultimately. And my bottom line here is all of this will lead to an intense security competition in Asia, especially East Asia, that will have real potential to erupt in war. Now, let me go to what is in effect the second part of my talk and talk about the implications for South Korea in particular. And there are four key issues here. First, will South Korea join the US-led balancing coalition against China that's now forming, or will its deep economic ties with Beijing and its never-ending hostility toward Japan instead cause it to bandwagon with China? My argument is that as the security competition heats up, South Korea is going to be forced to choose. The idea that you can sit on the sidelines and not pick sides in this one is delusional, in my opinion. You're going to have to make a decision whether you go with Uncle Sam or whether you go with China. In my opinion, the South Koreans will axiomatically go with the United States. It would be a very painful decision because of all the economic ties that South Korea has with China, and those economic ties will certainly push the South Koreans in the other direction. But in the end, in my view, security considerations always trump economic consideration, because security considerations are all about survival, and survival always has to be the number one goal. If there's a clash between survival on one hand and prosperity on the other, as wonderful as prosperity is, it has to take a back seat to survival. So I think security considerations will dominate, and the South Koreans will go with the United States. Second question, what are the implications of China's rise and the growing security competition that I described before for the unification of Korea? In my opinion, there's going to be no unification of Korea in the foreseeable future. And as the security competition here heats up, the prospect of unification will recede. First of all, North Korea is an important strategic asset for China. And there is no way that the Chinese are going to allow unification under South Korean auspices and in a world where South Korea is allied with the United States. There's no question that South Korea could have unification if it completely breaks its security relationship with the United States and becomes a neutral state and basically operates under Chinese suzerainty. Under those circumstances, you can have unification. But I do not believe that that's acceptable to South Korea. I do not believe that's acceptable to the United States. I believe that South Koreans are deeply committed at their core to maintaining their security relationship with the United States. And as long as that's the case, no unification, because the Chinese would be fools to allow the United States to basically march up to the Yalu River. You all remember what happened when we crossed the 38th parallel in 1950 and headed towards the Yalu River. The Chinese came in and the United States spent the next 3 years fighting against not the North Koreans, but fighting against the Chinese. So, in my opinion, no unification. Third, how should South Korea think about acquiring its own nuclear deterrent, given the dangers associated with China's rise, not to mention the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons and Japan has a breakout capability? I would note to you that this is a question that applies to Japan as well as it does to South Korea. As China continues to rise and China begins to throw its weight around in East Asia more and more, the South Koreans, like the Japanese, are going to have to face up to the fact that they don't have nuclear weapons. And they're going to think long and hard about getting nuclear weapons. As most of you in the audience know, the South Koreans were moving towards acquiring nuclear weapons in the latter half of the Cold War. It made perfect sense from a South Korean point of view. I think the United States will go to great lengths to make sure that neither South Korea nor Japan acquire nuclear weapons. It is not in our interest, it is not in America's interest for either South Korea or Japan to have nuclear weapons. It's much more important for us, for them to rely on the American nuclear umbrella. But if that's correct, that raises all sorts of questions of how the United States provides a credible nuclear deterrent for South Korea and for Japan. I think the United States made a big mistake when the Cold War ended to take its tactical nuclear weapons out of South Korea, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're eventually reintroduced. If I'm Japan and I'm thinking about making sure that there's a credible American nuclear guarantee to Tokyo, I begin to think about asking the Americans to place nuclear weapons in Japan. This may all sound far-fetched now, but again, we're hypothesizing a world where there's an increased security competition, and the Japanese and the South Koreans are thinking about the fact that a lot of the neighbors have nuclear weapons, and they do not have nuclear weapons. And there's going to be serious thought about this. Again, first about acquiring nuclear weapons of their own, both Japan and South Korea, and number two, if that doesn't happen, how to make sure that the American nuclear guarantee is a credible one. And it's a very tricky issue. Fourth, is it possible that China will eventually become so powerful that it will be impossible to prevent it from achieving hegemony in Asia? I find it very hard to figure out what the Chinese economy is going to look like 30 or 40 years from now. But if you assume that the Chinese really have figured out how to continue growing over the long term at an impressive rate, let's even say 5% per year for the next 30 or 40 years or something like that, this is a country that's going to be incredibly powerful. And one could argue that in the event that that happens, China will become so powerful that there's nothing the United States can do and nothing that China's neighbors can do to prevent it from dominating Asia. This may sound like an unbelievable scenario, but I would note to you that this is what happened with regard to Britain and the Western Hemisphere. Between 1783 and the middle of the 19th century, roughly 1860, the British went to great lengths to try and prevent the United States from dominating the Western Hemisphere. Britain did not want to see the United States become a regional hegemon in its region of the world. And indeed, the British gave serious consideration to intervening in the American Civil War on the side of the South so as to break the Union up into two great powers so that the North and the South would spend the rest of time competing with each other and would not be free to roam around the planet. Of course, the British eventually reached the conclusion, about 1860, that there was no way they could prevent the United States from dominating the Western Hemisphere. And the British basically gave up on trying to prevent hegemony because America was just too powerful. America had too many people and it was too wealthy. What I'm saying here is if China continues to grow at an impressive economic rate for decades on end, it, in the middle of the 21st century, could be so powerful that there's nothing the United States or any of China's neighbors can do to prevent it from dominating Asia. And in that case, we will then have two real hegemons in the world. Let me conclude with what I think is a fascinating question. I wrote here, what should we wish for? And what I'm talking about is what we should wish for regarding the Chinese economy. Most people today want to see the Chinese economy continue to grow because they think that that will be good for the prosperity of South Korea, Japan, the United States, and so forth and so on. But all I would say is that if you are wishing for the Chinese economy to grow and grow and grow, you should understand that you are pushing for an outcome that has negative strategic implications for South Korea, for the United States, for Taiwan, you will then end up with a situation where China is Godzilla and it dominates Asia, and there's really nothing any of us can do about that. I personally think that is not good, and therefore I hope the Chinese economy has all sorts of trouble in the years ahead. But I know, however, that I'm the odd man out on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mearsheimer. Now we will begin the Q&A session, which will proceed as a conversation between the lecturer and moderator. KNDA's Professor Choi Woo-sun will moderate the session.
Thank you for good advice for Korea's strategy and your insightful analysis of the East Asian politics. I will not ask you about theory today. I'll ask you about more mundane policy issues.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's start our discussion with the rebalancing of the United States. U.S. is gradually stepping off its balancing of China in the name of rebalancing in recent years. Do you think it is a substantial move? And
Do I think it's what?
do you think it is a substantial move? And do you think that it will be sustained despite a lot of problems in the Middle East and the fiscal problems in the United States?
I think with the pivot to Asia, the United States is definitely changing its strategic priorities. I often say to people that if you look at American strategic priorities over time, there are three areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere that we have traditionally treated as areas of great strategic significance: Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. And historically, Europe has been the most important area of the world for the United States. Even though we were attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor in World War II, we had a Europe-first policy throughout the war. And during the Cold War, the United States paid much more attention to Europe than it did to Asia. Which is not to say it paid no attention to Asia. I'm just saying that Europe was the number one area of the world from an American perspective, geopolitical perspective. We are now in the process of undergoing a fundamental change. Northeast Asia, I would argue more generally, East Asia, is going to become the most important area of the world for the United States. The Persian Gulf is going to become number two, and Europe is going to be a distant third. And this is reflected in rebalancing. This is what rebalancing is all about. The problem that we have today, we meaning the United States, is that we're addicted to war. And our addiction plays itself out, for the most part, in the greater Middle East. We just can't stop fighting wars there. And furthermore, we've pursued remarkably foolish policies in Europe that have precipitated a major crisis with Russia over Ukraine. So we have not, therefore, done a very good job of rebalancing because, one, we've created a mess in Europe that keeps our focus on Europe in large part, and number two, we're now in another war in the Middle East, this one against ISIS, which keeps our focus on the Middle East and makes it difficult to pivot. So the pivot or rebalancing has not been as efficacious as I would hope it would have been. But my argument would be that over the long term, because China is a potential peer competitor, the United States will rebalance in a really serious way.
Okay. As you mentioned, it will be very difficult to predict how powerful China will be in 2050. But still, in deciding the direction of our national strategy, we need to assess and predict the balance of power in Asia, at least 20 or 30 years from now. Let us talk about 2030. Do you think the United States will have a sufficient power and will to maintain the balance of power in Asia?
It's very difficult to say exactly what the balance of power will look like in Asia in 2030, in large part because it's difficult to predict what the Chinese economic trajectory will look like. I'm much more confident about the United States. The United States is in very good shape demographically. American women have almost 2.1 babies per woman, which is close to replacement rate. And we import huge numbers of people. This is what immigration is all about. And immigration, of course, is what's made the United States great over time. And there's no evidence that that's going to slow down in any meaningful way. So demographically, we're in good shape. And I think in terms of our economy, despite problems here and there, the United States has a great deal of creativity and a great deal of human capital, and we'll be fine. But the problem is we don't have anywhere near as many people as China has, and if China had a per capita GNP in 2030 that looked anything like South Korea, or was approximating South Korea's per capita GDP, we'd be in real trouble. So I think everything depends on China. Now, will we have the will to check China? In my opinion, there's no question about that. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors, and we will go to great lengths to contain China. So I have no doubt about that, and I believe we will have a lot of capability. How much the Chinese have is the question mark. But here's the most important issue. The most important issue from an American point of view, and this is true from all of China's neighbors' point of view, is that assuming that China continues to grow, time is on China's side. The Chinese, if they're really smart, would not cause any problems now and just continue to grow economically and militarily, and then begin to throw their weight around 20 years down the road. Now is not the time for China to throw its weight around, because the United States, I believe, is militarily much more powerful than China today. But all of this tells you it's in America's interest now to draw lines in the water or draw lines in the sand with the Chinese. Because as time goes by, our position becomes weaker and weaker. So when we talk today about whether or not the United States should drive an aircraft carrier or some naval ship within the 12 nautical mile boundary around Mischief Reef, I think from an American point of view, you want to do it now rather than later. You don't want to wait because the balance of power shifts against you over time. What the United States should want to do, and this is true of China's neighbors as well, is you should want to figure out what the rules of the road are going to be when the balance of power is most favorable from an American point of view.
Okay. I'll ask you about China. And you mentioned that China will try to dominate Asia for security reasons, ultimately. But if the United States and its allies in Asia can maintain the balance of power in this region, do you think China will still try to dominate? And if they do, in what ways will they make honest moves toward domination?
Well, I think that there's sort of two questions here. One is, will China try to dominate Asia? And number two, will they succeed? In my opinion, I think it's axiomatic that they will try to dominate Asia. And I do not blame the Chinese at all. If I was the Chinese National Security Advisor, I would tell them that we have to do everything possible to make sure we are by far the most powerful country in the region, and we have to do everything we can to break the military alliance between South Korea and the United States, and Japan and the United States, and push the Americans out of East Asia. If I'm in Beijing and I'm the National Security Advisor, I do not want the United States providing security for East Asia. It's just unacceptable to me. So in my opinion, the Chinese will try to dominate. The question is whether they can do it. And I think they cannot do it in the short term because the United States has a lot of capability and its neighbors have a lot of capability. Now, I made the argument to you, this is my fourth point in my presentation, and I've embellished it since in answering Woo-san's questions. I've said that it may be the case that China is just so powerful that there's nothing that we can do about it. There is a counter-argument to that, and the counter-argument is nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear weapons, the Indians have nuclear weapons, the Russians have nuclear weapons, and in a world where, let's just assume Japan and South Korea had their own nuclear weapons, there are real limits to what the Chinese can do. Because as we all know, nuclear weapons really focus the mind and they make everybody very, very cautious. And the thought of getting into a nuclear war is unthinkable. And I think if you therefore have a lot of nuclear powers in this security competition, one could argue there's no way that the Chinese can ever dominate Asia the way the United States dominated the Western Hemisphere. See, the great advantage that the United States had is, first of all, there were no nuclear weapons at the time, obviously, in the 19th century. But secondly, the only country that stood a chance of preventing America from achieving hegemony in the Western Hemisphere was Britain. And it had a huge power projection problem across the Atlantic Ocean, and it had no real allies in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is very good at projecting power. It has lots of allies, South Korea and Japan being two, and we live in a nuclear world. So you could argue that China will try to dominate Asia, but in the end, there's no way they can do it.
Okay. Let's turn to the issue of the positioning of Korea between the United States and China. You said that Korea will go with the United States for its own security. But these days, Korea is trying to develop our good relationship with China while maintaining our alliance with the United States. That is based on the assessment of the situation in this region. China is still focusing on economic development while avoiding the direct military confrontation with the United States. I think it is because Chinese leaders still realize that China is in a weaker position vis-a-vis the United States. And US is also trying to engage China while gradually stepping up its balancing in the name of rebalancing. So the basic state of the relationship between the US and China is the cooperation. Even though their competition is gradually increasing, still they are cooperating. In that kind of situation, many Koreans believe that we have room for diplomatic maneuver to develop the relationship both with the United States and China, and without antagonizing either. So, do you think it makes sense and it is possible and desirable for Korea to develop that kind of relationship with the United States and China, or we need to give a greater strategic priority to the relationship with the United States?
I think that South Korea's foreign policy now and over the past decade or so with regard to the United States and China has been very smart. The Chinese understand that it would be, the Koreans understand that it would be remarkably foolish to pick a fight with China. South Korea depends so heavily on economic intercourse with Korea for its prosperity that it has powerful incentives to play nice with the Chinese. At the same time, the South Koreans understand full well that for security purposes, it's absolutely essential that they maintain their alliance with the United States. So what South Korea has done is tried to position itself in the middle between these two countries and not be forced to choose. Smart. The question is, can South Korea sustain that policy over time? And the point that I'm making to you is that the security competition in East Asia is going to increase in intensity over time. Let's hope I'm wrong, but I do believe it is going to increase. And I think if you think about where we were 10 years ago and where we are today, there's lots of evidence that that security competition here has increased significantly. And my argument is, based on my theory, it's only going to get worse. And what that means, Woo-san, is that the Koreans are going to be forced to choose at some point. That's what's going to happen here. And again, my argument is that security always trumps prosperity. And therefore, Korea's relationship with the United States will ultimately be more important than Korea's relationship with China if Korea is forced to choose. And I think they will be forced to choose. And the case you want to think about here is not the Cold War, because there was remarkably little economic intercourse during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies. The case you want to think about is the period before World War I. In Europe, before World War I, there was a huge amount of economic cooperation, a huge amount of economic interdependence between all the players. Britain and Germany, Germany and France, Germany and Russia, France and Russia. Great deal of economic intercourse. And they all had a vested interest in not fighting a war. At the same time, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, ramping up to 1914, there was an increasing security competition centered around the rise of Germany. So in Europe before World War I, much like in Asia today, you had a security competition that pointed in that direction, and you had an economic cooperation that pointed in that direction. And when push came to shove in 1914, you know what happened. You got World War I, right? So you had this situation where in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all sorts of countries in Europe could act like South Korea has been acting, and they could get the best of both worlds. But in 1914, even a little bit before 1914, most countries had to choose sides. And my point is, Korea will eventually be forced to choose.
Personally, I agree with you that considering the growing power of China and the geographical location, I think Korea will maintain its alliance with the United States, the option power and stabilizer, rather than bandwagoning with China. But the problem is that the alliance is basically two-way business. Even if we choose to be allied with the United States also have to find that Korea is a valuable ally. Do you think that even in the future, even after the unification, United States will consider Korea as a valuable ally? And do you think what should we do to remain as a valuable ally in the future?
I don't know, to be honest, exactly what Korea has to do to be a valuable ally. I mean, this really gets to the nitty-gritty of how you contain China. I think it's pretty easy to answer that question with regard to Japan. And I think a lot of what's going on in Japan explains, how the Japanese will deal with this rising China threat. And they'll develop much more powerful naval forces, air forces, and some ground forces. But I don't see South Korea doing much more than maintaining the status quo in terms of its military capabilities, and basically going to great lengths to maintain deterrence against North Korea and ultimately China on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay. We'll have another question. Would you turn on the video? We have a question we videotaped. 비디오 켜주시겠어요?
Good morning, Professor Mearsheimer. I think in Northeast Asia, there has been high security uncertainty, and Korea is located at the center of the region. So I would like to ask you a question. Among North Korea, China, Japan, Russia, and the United States, which country do you think would be the biggest possible threat to Korean security in the future?
I think it's commonplace in South Korea to say that the biggest threat to South Korea is North Korea. I think most South Koreans are very reluctant to talk about China as a threat because most South Koreans don't want to antagonize the Chinese. And I think that makes good strategic sense. I think even even Koreans who think that China is going to be a big problem don't say that publicly because you don't want to offend the Chinese. I don't want to diminish the importance of the North Korean threat, but the greatest threat, in my opinion, to South Korea over time is China, not North Korea. And I think that Japan is not a threat at all. Japan is a declining great power. It has the most rapidly aging population in the world. And this is not 1938 or 1910. Japan's just not a serious threat to Korea. The United States is certainly not a serious threat to Korea. The only extent to which the United States might be a threat to Korea is the United States may pursue a foolish policy and get everybody in trouble. But the United States is not a threat. And Russia is not a threat to Korea either because Russia, much like Japan, is a declining great power. It's in demographic trouble. Its economy is in trouble. It was even in trouble before sanctions were levied by the West as a result of the Ukraine crisis. So I think there are just two countries that matter. One is China, and two is North Korea. And of course, those two countries are linked in very important ways. But I think that ultimately China is the real threat. Because I think if China were to dominate Asia, China were to become a hegemon in Asia, that would not be good for South Korea's security.
Thank you. Time is running out. But we'll take one or two questions from audience before we close our session. Here.
Thank you very, very much. And I enjoyed your presentation, and I learned a great deal. I have a couple questions. One is the soft power. The countries, China, the United States, is not only different in power, in the size of power, but the identity of each country. China does not have what you call soft power or democracy, freedom, and attraction. The importance to me is that soft power is not only attraction from soft elements, But today, soft power breeds hard power, not the other way around. Hard power cannot breed soft power. The United States is number one soft power in the world. That's why we have an alliance. Second question is,
Could I answer your first question, and then I'll answer the second one? Just because I'll forget it, and it's an
Okay.
excellent question. But I'll answer your second question, too.
Okay, you go on.
First of all, you and I disagree completely about the relationship or the balance of power between soft power and hard power. I think that hard power is what really matters, not soft power. But much more importantly, you like soft power, and you think the United States has a lot of soft power and China doesn't because you're friendly with the United States. If you're in Moscow today, do you like American soft power? No. If you're in Iran today, do you like American soft power? No. If you're in Beijing today, do you like American soft power? No. And by the way, let's go down to Latin America, where the United States has a rich history of ruthless intervention and doing terrible things to its neighbors. We talk about a good neighbor policy. We've often pursued what I'd call a bad neighbor policy. You think they like our soft power? You think they think we're wonderful? No. So you like American soft power because you are friendly with the United States. And with regard to the Chinese, I actually think the Chinese are quite adept at soft power. They tell stories about how wonderful they are, how benign they are, just like the Americans do. When I hear the Chinese talking about their Confucian culture and their positive values, they sound just like Americans talking about American exceptionalism and freedom and liberty and so forth and so on. So don't underestimate how good the Chinese are.
okay. My second question, thank you for your answer. My second question is that the unification of North Korea. If we use hard power of one kind or another, hard power, Chinese may not like it. And also if we march north with the American forces and pose our forces and American forces along the Yalu River, of course they wouldn't like that. But we have a way to unify our country which Chinese cannot intervene. That is when people of North Korea, people of armed forces, the officials, government bureaucrats, the three elements, if they rise up and overthrow their country, their regime, Kim Jong-un, I don't think China can intervene. The world will not sit like that. That's my feeling. What do you think about it?
I hate to keep disagreeing with you, but with all, but with all due respect, I believe the Chinese will instantaneously intervene. All my conversations with the Chinese behind closed doors tell me that there's no way they're ever going to allow North Korea to integrate with a South Korea that is allied with the United States. Because by definition, North Korea is then part of the American security alliance, and the Americans are in effect right on the Yalu River. And who's to stop them from intervening? If they do intervene, let's assume that the North Korean political elite or political system collapses, and it's clear that they would like to ally with South Korea, and the Chinese decide to intervene. Who's going to stop them? The United States? Do you really think the United States is going to cross the 38th parallel and go to war against China to prevent China from taking over North Korea? You think South Korea is going to pick a fight with China? You think the Americans are going to allow South Korea to do that? I don't think so. I think the Chinese will march in. I'll tell you, if I was in control in Beijing, that's what I'd do. And I'd have extensive contingency plans for that. There's no way I'm going to let the South Koreans take North Korea, because that means the Americans take North Korea too. And there's no way I'm going to let the Americans on my border along the Yellow River. So I think you're wrong on that one, with all due respect.
Okay, the gentleman already asked a couple of good questions. Actually, the time ran out. So I think it's time to close our discussion. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.